Grace sat on the worn couch, holding her newborn twins, Lily and Noah, both crying. Her own exhaustion mirrored in the tears that streaked her cheeks. She hadn't slept more than 2 hours in days, and the isolation was suffocating. The apartment, once filled with warmth and laughter, now seemed foreign, empty. Ethan stood by the door, suitcase in hand. His expression was cold, distant. The man she had loved for years, the father of her children, was a stranger. "I'm leaving," Ethan said, his voice flat. Grace looked up, disbelief clouding her tear-streaked face. Her grip tightened around the twins, as if holding them would stop him from walking out of their lives. "You can't just leave us," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying, from pleading. "Ethan, we need you. I need you." He sighed, his patience visibly thinning. "This isn't working anymore. I'm done, Grace. I'm with Alexis now." The name hit her like a punch in the gut. Alexis. The woman he had chosen over their family. The woman who wasn't here, wasn't holding their children, wasn't going through sleepless nights. Grace felt the world tilt under her feet. How could he leave? How could he just walk away from everything they had built? "But the twins are family," Grace choked out, her voice trembling with desperation. "You'll manage," Ethan said, his indifference cutting deeper than any argument could. "You're strong. You'll be fine. I'm not happy anymore, and Alexis, she understands me." Grace stared at him, her mind numb. How could he say that? How could he think that another woman could replace the life they had shared, the sacrifices she had made for him? She had been there for him through everything, and now, when she needed him the most, he was leaving. He turned to leave, his hand on the door. "I'll send money for the kids." And then he was gone. The door clicked shut, and Grace was left alone, the weight of his absence crushing her. The twins continued to cry, but Grace couldn't move. She felt paralyzed, as if all the strength had drained from her body the moment he walked out. Her mind flashed back to the beginning, when things were different. When they were happy. She remembered their wedding day, how Ethan had promised to always be there, to be her partner in everything. She remembered the excitement they shared when they found out she was pregnant. But now, all of that felt like a cruel joke. Those memories mocked her, reminded her of how far they had fallen. As the baby's cries grew louder, Grace wiped her tears. She had to move, had to do something. She couldn't fall apart, not now. Not when her children needed her. Slowly she got up, her legs shaky beneath her, and walked over to the crib. She placed Lily and Noah inside, her hands trembling. The apartment was quiet now, except for the faint sound of their breathing. Grace stood in the dimly lit room, staring at the door, waiting for Ethan to come back. But deep down, she knew he wouldn't. She walked to the mirror, her reflection startling her. The woman staring back at her looked broken, hollow. She barely recognized herself. Where was the woman who had once been full of life, full of hope? Where was the woman who had believed in love, in family? Grace clenched her fists, feeling a surge of anger. How could he do this to her? How could he do this to their children? She had given him everything, sacrificed everything, and this was how he repaid her. By leaving. By abandoning her when she was at her most vulnerable. But even as the anger simmered, a small voice inside her whispered that she had no choice. She had to survive. Not for Ethan. Not for the life they had lost. But for her children. For herself. Grace took a deep breath, wiping the last of her tears. She would figure it out. She had to. There was no other option. Ethan was gone, but she was still here. She was still standing. And somehow, she would keep going. The days after Ethan left were a blur of sleepless nights and endless tasks. Grace moved through each day on autopilot, trying to keep up with the constant demands of caring for the twins. Every time she looked at them, her heart ached, but she pushed the pain aside. There was no time to wallow, no time to think. Every hour was dedicated to their needs, feeding, changing, comforting. Her phone buzzed occasionally with messages from friends offering support, but she couldn't bring herself to answer. What would she even say? How could she explain the shame, the heartbreak, the anger that simmered just beneath the surface? She couldn't afford to break down. Not when so much depended on her holding it together. Bills piled up on the kitchen counter, a constant reminder of the life she had to maintain on her own now. Ethan had sent some money, but it wasn't enough. It never was. She knew she had to start thinking about going back to work, but how? With 2 infants and no one to help, the logistics felt impossible. The weight of it all pressed down on her, suffocating her. One afternoon, as she sat at the kitchen table, staring at her laptop, trying to figure out how to make everything work, there was a knock on the door. It was Mrs. Thompson, her elderly neighbor. Grace hadn't spoken to her much before, but today, Mrs. Thompson stood there with a warm smile and a casserole dish in hand. "I thought you might need this," she said softly, stepping inside. Grace blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness. For the first time in days, she didn't feel completely alone. Mrs. Thompson didn't stay long, but her visit was a turning point. Over the next few days, she began stopping by regularly, offering help without asking for anything in return. Whether it was watching the twins for an hour while Grace showered or simply sitting with her for a cup of tea, the small gestures felt monumental. Grace hadn't realized how much she needed the company, how much she needed someone to just be there, even in silence. As the weeks passed, Grace found herself slowly settling into a routine. It wasn't easy, and every day still felt like a battle, but she was starting to find her footing. She picked up freelance work, writing articles during the few quiet hours when the twins were napping. It wasn't much, but it helped, and more importantly, it gave her something to focus on other than the pain. In those rare moments of peace, she began to rediscover parts of herself she had long forgotten. She pulled out an old sketchbook, one she hadn't touched in years. The lines she drew were shaky at first, her hand out of practice, but soon the familiar rhythm returned. It was comforting, like finding an old friend. And then there were the books. She had always loved reading, but during her marriage she had let that part of herself slip away. Now, in the quiet of the night, after the twins were asleep, she would curl up with a novel and escape into someone else's world, if only for a little while. It wasn't much, but these small moments helped her feel like herself again. Her friends, too, began to reach out more persistently. At first, Grace was hesitant. She didn't want to burden anyone with her problems. But eventually, she accepted their invitations, meeting them for coffee or inviting them over for a quick chat. She hadn't realized how much she had isolated herself, even before Ethan left. Slowly, she started to reconnect, rebuilding the relationships she had neglected during her marriage. One evening, she found herself at a local support group for single mothers. She had been reluctant to go, unsure of what she would say or if she even belonged there. But as she listened to the other women share their stories, she realized she wasn't alone. Each of them had faced their own version of heartbreak, of struggle. They understood in a way no one else could. It was there that she met Daniel. He wasn't like the other people she had met in the group, but his quiet presence was comforting. He rarely spoke, but when he did, it was always thoughtful, always kind. There was a sadness in his eyes, a weariness that mirrored her own. Over time, they began to talk more, sharing bits and pieces of their lives. Daniel had been through his own share of hardships, and while he never pried, he listened when Grace needed to vent. Their conversations were simple, often just about day-to-day life, but there was something about him that put Grace at ease. He didn't look at her with pity or judgment. He saw her strength, even when she couldn't see it herself. Life didn't suddenly become easy. The struggles were still there: financial stress, the endless demands of motherhood, the emotional toll of Ethan's betrayal. But for the first time, Grace felt like she was moving forward, like she was becoming someone she could be proud of again. There were days when the weight of it all still pressed down on her, when she felt like she was drowning. But now, there were also moments of light, moments where she could breathe, where she could see a future that didn't feel so bleak. And slowly, without even realizing it, Grace began to smile again. Not often, and not always, but enough to know that somehow, she was going to be okay. Ethan's new life with Alexis wasn't what he had imagined. At first, it had seemed like everything he wanted: freedom, excitement, the allure of something different. Alexis was glamorous, successful, and completely focused on her career. They spent their days in upscale restaurants, going to events, and living a life that felt exhilarating, at least for a while. But the thrill faded quickly. Alexis was constantly working, taking business calls late into the night, traveling frequently, and leaving Ethan behind. Their relationship wasn't built on the same foundation he'd had with Grace. There was no depth, no connection. It felt hollow. Alexis wasn't interested in building a life together, only in pursuing her own ambitions. The cracks in their relationship started to show, but Ethan didn't want to admit it at first. He found himself thinking about Grace more than he cared to admit. He told himself leaving her was the right decision, that Alexis was better for him, but now, in the quiet moments when Alexis wasn't around, he couldn't shake the feeling of regret. He missed the warmth of home, the simple comforts of the life he had abandoned. He missed the twins, their laughter, the little moments of joy that used to fill his days. With Grace, there had been love, understanding, and a sense of belonging that he had taken for granted. One night, after another argument with Alexis about her endless work schedule, Ethan sat alone in their cold, modern apartment. He stared at his phone, tempted to call Grace. He had told himself he was happier now, but deep down, he knew that wasn't true. His new life wasn't what he had thought it would be. It felt like he had traded something real for something fleeting. Meanwhile, Grace's life had continued to grow, quietly, steadily. She hadn't thought much about Ethan in recent weeks. She was too busy, too focused on her own healing, her own journey. Her world was still centered around the twins, but there was more to her life now. There were the moments of peace she found in her work, in her friendships, in the small joys of everyday life that had once felt impossible to reach. Daniel had become a constant presence, someone who understood her without needing to ask. They didn't talk about Ethan much, and she was grateful for that. Their conversations were about the present, about the little victories she had achieved, about the future she was slowly beginning to imagine for herself. She wasn't in a rush to move on or start something new, but Daniel's kindness, his quiet support, was something she had come to rely on. Ethan's first attempt to reach out came in the form of a message, simple, almost casual, but filled with unspoken weight. "How are the kids?" he asked, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't walked out on them months ago. Grace stared at the screen, her emotions a mix of anger and disbelief. She didn't respond. She didn't owe him anything, not anymore. Days passed, and Ethan's messages became more frequent. He started asking to see the twins, asking to talk. Grace ignored most of them, but eventually, out of a sense of obligation, she agreed to let him visit. She didn't do it for him. She did it for Lily and Noah, who deserved to know their father, no matter how much he had failed them. The first meeting was awkward, tense. Ethan looked different, older, more tired. Grace watched him as he fumbled his way through the visit, trying too hard to play the role of the doting father, a role that felt forced and unnatural. The twins didn't know him anymore. They cried when he tried to hold them, and Grace had to intervene, soothing them with the ease of someone who had been there all along. Ethan seemed shaken by the reality of it. This wasn't the life he had imagined when he left. He had thought he could just come back and everything would fall into place. But it was clear now how much he had missed, how much he had lost. After that, Ethan began visiting more often, trying to reconnect with the children, trying to find a way back into their lives, and Grace's. He apologized over and over, telling her how wrong he had been, how much he regretted leaving. He talked about how things with Alexis had fallen apart, how he realized now that he had made a mistake. He wanted to come home, to be a family again. But Grace wasn't the same woman he had left behind. The months without him had changed her, hardened her in some ways, but also made her stronger. She listened to his apologies, but they didn't stir the same emotions they once would have. She didn't feel the same pull toward him, the same desire to fix what had been broken. Ethan was part of her past now, and while she didn't hate him, she couldn't see him in her future. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about the life she had built for herself, the person she had become. She didn't need him anymore, not like she once had. She had learned to stand on her own, and that independence was something she wasn't willing to give up. Ethan tried harder, showing up unannounced, pleading with her to give him another chance. But every time he did, Grace felt more certain of her decision. She wasn't angry anymore, just resolute. Her life, her happiness, didn't revolve around him. She had found something more important, herself. Daniel, too, had become a quiet presence in her life. There was no rush between them, no pressure to define what they had. It was enough to know that he saw her, truly saw her, and accepted her for who she was. With him, there was no need to pretend, no need to be anything other than what she had become, a woman who had faced heartbreak and come out stronger. Ethan's return hadn't shaken her. If anything, it had reinforced what she already knew. She didn't need to go back. She didn't need to fix what had been broken. What she needed, and what she had finally found, was the strength to move forward. Grace stood at the kitchen sink, washing dishes as the twins played nearby. She heard the knock on the door, and without even turning, she knew it was Ethan. He had been coming by more frequently lately, each time with the same purpose. Today, she knew, would be no different. He wanted to talk again. To plead his case. She took a deep breath, dried her hands, and opened the door. Ethan stood there, looking tired, his eyes filled with a familiar desperation. "Grace, can we talk? Please?" he asked, his voice softer than before, but she could sense the weight of what he wanted to say. She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. He moved to the living room, glancing at the twins as they giggled and played, seemingly unaware of the tension hanging in the air. He sat down, his hands resting nervously on his knees. "I've been thinking," he began, "about everything. About what I did. Leaving you, the kids, it was the biggest mistake of my life. I didn't realize how much I had until I lost it." He paused, looking up at her, waiting for some kind of reaction. Grace remained silent, her face calm. She had heard these words before. The regret, the apologies. She had seen the sincerity in his eyes, but it didn't move her like it once would have. She let him continue. "I thought Alexis was what I wanted, that she understood me in ways you didn't. But I was wrong. She never cared about me the way you did, the way we were. I didn't appreciate it then. But I do now. I want to come home, Grace. I want to make things right." His voice cracked, as if he were on the verge of tears. "I want us to be a family again." Grace felt a wave of emotions rise inside her, but it wasn't the rush of hope or longing she had expected. It was a quiet realization, one she had been approaching for a while now. She didn't need this from him anymore. She didn't need him to validate her worth or to repair the family he had broken. She had already begun the process of healing without him. "I don't hate you, Ethan," she said, her voice steady. "I really don't. And I'm glad you've realized what you lost. But you didn't just leave me. You left us, and I had to pick up the pieces. I had to be everything for these kids and for myself. And in doing that, I learned something important. I don't need you." Ethan looked stunned. He had expected her to be angry, hurt, maybe even hopeful for reconciliation. But her calmness, her certainty, seemed to take him by surprise. Grace continued, "I forgive you. Not for your sake, but for mine. Carrying around the pain and resentment was weighing me down, and I've let it go. But that doesn't mean I can go back to the way things were. I can't unsee the person I became after you left, and I won't give that up to try and rebuild something that's already fallen apart." He looked down at his hands, his shoulders slumping as the weight of her words sank in. "I get it," he said quietly. "I understand. I just hoped." Grace shook her head gently. "It's not about what you hoped, Ethan. It's about what I need now. And what I need is to keep moving forward. We'll always be connected because of the twins, and I want them to have a relationship with you. But as far as you and I go, that chapter is closed. The finality in her voice was undeniable. Ethan nodded, defeated but accepting. "I'll be here for them," he said, glancing at the twins who were now looking curiously at their father. "I'll be here for them, whatever they need." Grace smiled slightly, the weight of the conversation lifting from her shoulders. "That's all I ask?" He stood to leave, hesitating for a moment as if there were something more he wanted to say, but he thought better of it. With a final nod, he turned and walked to the door, closing it gently behind him. Grace stood there for a moment, taking in the silence that followed. It felt different this time, lighter, free of the tension that had once gripped her. She turned back to the twins, who had now resumed playing, blissfully unaware of the shift that had just occurred. Over the next few days, Grace found herself reflecting on how far she had come. She no longer defined her life by what Ethan had done or the pain he had caused. She had moved beyond that. Her life was her own now, shaped by her choices, her strength, and her resilience. Daniel's quiet presence in her life had continued to grow. They spent more time together, their relationship deepening in a way that felt natural, unhurried. He never pushed, never asked for more than what she was ready to give. And that, more than anything, had allowed her to see the possibility of a future with someone new, not out of need, but out of choice. One evening, as they sat in the park watching the twins play, Daniel turned to her, his expression gentle but serious. "You seem different lately," he said. "Lighter, maybe." Grace smiled, nodding. "I think I am. I feel like I've finally let go of something I didn't even realize I was holding on to." Daniel didn't ask for details. He simply smiled back, understanding without needing words. They sat in comfortable silence, watching as the sun set behind the trees. For the first time in a long while, Grace felt at peace. She didn't know what the future held, but she wasn't afraid of it anymore. She had built something strong and lasting, within herself and for her children. And whatever came next, she was ready to face it, not as someone who had been broken, but as someone who had learned how to rebuild. The past was behind her now, and the future stretched out ahead, full of possibilities. She had found her way through the storm, and now, standing on the other side, she knew she could weather anything that came her way.